1943. Bengal, India. People are dying in the streets, not one or two people, not hundreds, millions of people. Mothers holding children who stopped moving days ago. Farmers who grew food their entire lives now eating grass to survive. Bodies on the sides of roads that nobody has the strength to move. 3 million people dead in 1 year, in one region. While the British Empire controlled every port, every ship, every grain supply in the entire country. And in London, Winston Churchill, the man who controlled all of it, was asked directly to send emergency food supplies to Bengal. He said no, not just no. What he actually said when he was told about the scale of the dying, that is the part of this story that historians argued about for decades. And when you hear it, you will understand why the British government kept it buried for as long as they possibly could. This is that story. To understand what happened in Bengal in 1943, you need to understand the situation Churchill was dealing with in the years before. India in the early 1940s was the crown jewel of the British Empire. Hundreds of millions of people under British colonial control. Indian soldiers fighting in British armies across North Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. Indian resources feeding the British war machine. And Bengal specifically was one of the most densely populated and agriculturally productive regions in the entire subcontinent. Rice fields stretching as far as you could see. A region that had fed itself and exported food for generations. Then in 1942, everything changed. Japan entered the war and rapidly took control of Burma, right on Bengal's eastern border. Suddenly, the war was no longer something happening far away in Europe. It was on India's doorstep. Churchill's response to the Japanese threat was to implement what was called a denial policy in Bengal. The idea was simple and brutal. Remove everything the Japanese could use if they invaded. Boats were destroyed. Tens of thousands of small fishing and transport boats that Bengali farmers and fishermen depended on completely. Rice stocks were seized and removed. Transport infrastructure was dismantled. The Japanese never actually invaded Bengal. But the denial policy had already done its damage. The boats were gone. The reserve grain stocks were gone. The transportation networks were broken. And then the rice harvest partially failed in late 1942. The combination was catastrophic, and what happened next was not an accident. By early 1943, people in Bengal were beginning to starve, not quietly and privately, visibly, publicly, in the streets of Calcutta and in villages across the countryside. British officials on the ground in India were sending urgent messages to London. The situation is critical. People are dying. We need emergency food supplies immediately. We need ships diverted. We need grain released from military stockpiles. The messages were clear. The scale was clear. The solution was clear. And in London, the requests landed on Churchill's desk. Churchill's response was to blame the Indians themselves. He wrote in official communications that the famine was their own fault, that Indians were breeding like rabbits and had brought this on themselves, that Indian leaders were exaggerating the situation for political purposes. These are not accusations made by his enemies. These are words documented in official British government records, in the minutes of war cabinet meetings, in Churchill's own communications, written down at the time by the people in the room. Leo Amery, Churchill's own Secretary of State for India, wrote in his private diary that Churchill's attitude toward India was, quote, Hitler-like. Those are the words of Churchill's own cabinet minister. written privately, not for public consumption. And while Churchill was writing memos about Indians breeding like rabbits, the dying in Bengal was accelerating. The requests for emergency food aid kept coming, from British officials in India, from the Indian government, from military commanders on the ground who could see with their own eyes what was happening. Churchill blocked them, consistently, repeatedly, over months. Ships that could have carried grain to Bengal were redirected to carry military supplies to Europe and to build up stockpiles in other parts of the empire. When the Australian government offered to send wheat directly to India, Churchill's War Cabinet blocked the shipment. When the Canadian government offered emergency grain supplies, the request was delayed and obstructed. The official reason given was wartime shipping shortages. There were not enough ships to transport emergency food while also supplying the war effort. This was the public position. But historians who later examined the shipping records found something that directly contradicted this explanation. During the same period that grain shipments to India were being blocked due to supposed shipping shortages, Britain was actually importing more grain than usual into Britain itself, stockpiling it, building up reserves. The ships existed, the grain existed. The choice was made to send it somewhere else. And the famine in Bengal got worse every single month throughout 1943. 3 million people. That is the conservative estimate. Some historians put the figure at 4 million or higher. To put that number in context, the entire death toll of British military forces during the entire Second World War was around 380,000 people. The Bengal famine killed roughly 8 times that number, in one region, in 1 year. People were dying in the streets of Calcutta, one of the largest cities in the British Empire, and British administrators were stepping over bodies on their way to their offices. This was not happening in some remote area impossible to reach. This was happening in the heart of a major imperial city with functioning British administrative infrastructure all around it. Photographs taken at the time show skeletal figures lying in gutters, children with visible rib cages, mass graves being dug by people barely strong enough to hold a shovel. Those photographs existed. British officials saw them. They were sent to London. Churchill saw them. And in August 1943, when the death toll was already in the millions and the famine showed no signs of ending, Churchill sent a telegram to the Viceroy of India asking why Gandhi had not died yet. Gandhi was on a hunger strike at the time protesting British colonial rule. That telegram is in the archives. Those words are real. The famine in Bengal finally began to ease in late 1943 and into 1944, not primarily because of emergency aid from Britain, but because of a combination of factors: a better harvest, intervention by the new Viceroy Lord Wavell, who took office in late 1943 and immediately made famine relief his absolute priority, and eventually some grain shipments that Churchill's War Cabinet finally approved after sustained pressure. Lord Wavell was direct in his assessment. He wrote privately that the famine was a man-made disaster, that it had been caused and extended by policy decisions made in London, that the people who died did not have to die. Wavell pushed hard for emergency grain imports throughout late 1943 and into 1944. He got some of what he asked for, not all of it. Churchill continued to obstruct full-scale emergency relief, even as the death toll mounted. The question historians have wrestled with ever since is exactly how much of what happened was deliberate policy and how much was criminal negligence. whether Churchill actively wanted Bengalis to die or whether he simply did not care enough about their lives to prioritize saving them over other wartime objectives. The answer to that question depends partly on how you interpret the words he used when he talked about it, and those words are not ambiguous. The most documented and most discussed Churchill quote about the Bengal famine comes from a war cabinet meeting in 1943. When presented with evidence of mass starvation and urged to prioritize emergency relief, Churchill said, and this is documented in the official war cabinet minutes, that the famine was the fault of the Indians themselves for breeding like rabbits. He also asked in the same meeting why Gandhi had not yet died during his hunger strike. The implication being that Gandhi's survival was an inconvenience. In other communications, Churchill described Indians as the beastliest people in the world after the Germans. Leo Amery recorded in his diary after one war cabinet discussion about India that he did not see much difference between Churchill's outlook and Hitler's. Amery was a conservative politician, a lifelong imperialist himself, a man who broadly supported British rule in India. This was not an anti-Churchill critic. This was his own cabinet minister writing privately that Churchill's attitude toward Indian lives was comparable to Hitler's. These words were not spoken in the heat of one moment. They were consistent across multiple meetings and multiple documents over months and years. Churchill's contempt for Indian lives was not a slip. It was a position. Churchill is remembered in Britain and across the Western world as the man who saved civilization, the man who stood alone against Hitler when everyone else was ready to make peace, the greatest Briton who ever lived according to a BBC poll, his face on banknotes, statues in Parliament Square, and all of that is one part of a complete picture. The other part is Bengal, 1943. 3 million people dead. Ships full of grain redirected away from a famine, while Churchill wrote memos blaming the victims for their own deaths. Both things are true about the same man. The man who gave the greatest speeches in defense of human freedom in the 20th century presided over one of the largest famines in modern history and actively obstructed relief efforts while it was happening. This is not a story the British education system spends much time on. The Bengal famine appears in very few British school curriculums. Churchill's role in it is even less discussed. But the documents exist. The war cabinet minutes exist. The telegrams exist. The diary entries exist. The shipping records exist. History does not have to be comfortable to be true. And the full picture of any leader, no matter how celebrated, includes the decisions they made when the people dying were far away and easy to ignore. 3 million people were not easy to ignore. Churchill ignored them anyway. If this made you think differently about history, subscribe. Every week, we go deeper into the stories they left out of the textbooks.